Rebecca here in her plenary mentions that in Russia, English is not the medium of instruction. Still, in the leading universities in Russia, students are more and more exposed to English. And though it is not the main medium of instruction, some courses or even educational programs are offered in English. At the same time, students taking these courses are not given any special help or instruction in academic writing skills. So they have to learn how to write in the process of writing. And in my talk today, I will provide some ideas of how academic writing skills might be developed in a content-based course. Of course, these ideas are not new and they are well developed in writing across curriculum approach. But usually writing across curriculum approach is implemented in those universities where English is the medium of instruction. And I'm going to speak about Russian university. So I will present the results of linguistic analysis of stance markers in academic essays written by Russian students in English, which is their second language, in a content-based course, team taught via teleconference to a group of American students from Connecticut College, USA, and Russian students from National Research University in St. Petersburg, High School of Economics in St. Petersburg. Very probably, stance might be defined as personal feelings, attitudes, value, judgments, or assessments. And in my talk today, I will discuss the use of the students' use of first-person pronouns, verbs of argumentations, reporting verbs, and very briefly some epistemic adjectives, adverbs used for hedging and boosting. So I will suggest that the ability to express writer's stance and to develop a supportive argument might be developed through the introduction of some elements of EAP teaching into a content-based course. Well, but before I do this, I want to mention just a couple of things about the development of writing skills at university in Russia in general. And I'd like to refer to the Soviet times first, because in Soviet Russia, as well as in many other Eastern European countries, writing competence was not regarded as a key one, and it was not considered as a goal in teaching of education. Writing was never used in assessment, and the key genres that students were exposed to were lecture note-taking, literature review notes, and referats, that is, reports on a subject summarizing some previously read texts. Well, there isn't a lot of research into the development of academic skills at the present-day situation, in present-day Russia, but there are studies that exist that they stress that very little has changed since the Soviet time. And though there has been a shift from the culture of oral assessment to written exams, there is still no systematic teaching of writing. And students still write those genres that imply summarizing but not arguing, analyzing, or providing their own judgments. So my students can't argue. That's a recurrent claim of many Russian university professors. And again, you can guess that in such a context, one of the students' abilities that is underdeveloped is the ability to take a stance, to construct arguments. And again, if they face difficulties in writing writing argumentative text in their native language, when the assessment is done through academic essays in English, they face a lot of difficulties. So in the fall 2014, my colleague from Connecticut College, USA, Andrew Lemieux, and I taught a course, The Net Generation, Russian and American Youth Culture. It included 17 students from Russia and 18 students from the USA. It was team taught in real time. So our idea was very simple. We wanted to teach a course on a topic that would be of mutual interest to both groups of students. At the same time, we wanted our students to serve as native informants for each other, for their peers at work. That's why the topic of youth culture was chosen. So, I'm sorry, this is layout. So in the course of 4 months, our students completed readings, viewed films, participated in online discussion boards, and they had to write every week to make a post every week. They wrote 3 short essays and completed a project, either individually or in a group. Well, the next generation course was not a language course. It was based on the ideas of clock movement, culture and language across the curriculum, which stresses the importance of functional communication over grammatical accuracy. That's why their language inaccuracies didn't affect the grades of the students, as long as their ideas were understandable. And we wanted our students to discuss, to participate in all kinds of discussion, to express their opinions as much as possible. But as I have mentioned, the course contained substantial writing components, discussion board posts, projects, and essay writings. Well, essay topics addressed controversial issues such as the cost of higher education, academic integrity, essentialist and non-essentialist gender norms, and all these topics required a clear positioning from students. Sometimes it was identified in the assignments. For example, assignment 1, students asked to describe, analyze, and to interpret the material, to make an argument, and in assignment 2, to produce a piece of writing that convincingly argues a point. Well, it was not a language course, but we predicted that Russian students would probably have a lot of problems in writing essays because it was, for them, it was the first experience when they were supposed to write essays. That's why before the first essay was written, we explained to the students what was expected from them in terms of the genre. So we got the first essay, we read them, and decided not to grade them, because there was a huge difference in the quality of writing between two groups of students. And the difference was not among native and non-native speakers of English. The difference was more between those students who were more experienced writers, American students, because for them, well, they knew how to write, and Russian students who have never written anything in English before. Well, they were trained to take IELTS exam, so they were familiar with the genre of essay writing in IELTS, but it didn't help in the situation when they were to produce, to write real essays. Well, so after this, what we did, we decided to post all 34 essays unattributed and with the students' permission to our Moodle discussion, to our Moodle site. And in fact, we asked students to read all 34 essays because we wanted them to compare how their peers abroad responded to the same set of questions. And in fact, course evaluation, the evaluation forms, in the course evaluation form, this exercise was cited as one of the most instructive and illuminating of the whole course. After that, I had a special meeting with students, extra meeting, well, I just invited them to come, devoted to essay writing. And I asked them two questions. I'm sorry, I'm doing so well. So if they were able to identify which essays were written by American students and which one by Russian students, and in what ways the essays were different. Of course, they had no difficulties at all saying who wrote what. But beside the obvious fact that American students, their English is much better, they identified the following things. American students use the sources, they express their opinions and base the arguments on some evidence, and in many cases they generalize, not only write about their own experience. In fact, these were the three major differences between the two groups of essays. Russian students tended to avoid the sources. They usually made their claims without providing enough evidence, and very often they wrote about their own personal experience. So they didn't refer to the sources or other course materials. We had a similar analytical session after the second essay was written. I also had individual tutorials with students where I tried to draw their attention to some elements of essay writing, such as structure, structured paragraph, essay structure, thesis statement, coherence, references to sources. And we also regularly referred to discussion board posts. And I asked the students not only to read what American students wrote, but to pay attention how they did it. So how they positioned themselves, how they provided the arguments, how they developed the arguments, and how they referenced. and so on. So I'm coming to the analysis itself. So I analyzed 45 essays written during the course. So generally I used Ken Hyland's model of analysis of stance taking strategies, but I restricted it to self-manches, to hedges and boosters in Ken Hyland's terminology, and I also included some evidential expressions that referred to the source of knowledge that the students use. Well, the corpus consisted of 3 subcorpora, essay 1, 2, and 3, each containing 15 essays, and the total word count is about 39,000 words, so meaning that essays were short, a little bit less than 1,000 words. So we asked the students to produce a piece of writing not less than 800 words. Okay, so I will start with the analysis of first-person singular pronouns. As you can see from the table, students, even in the first essay, students very often used first-person pronouns. It means that they position themselves in the text. But if you look at the frequency of the pronoun use, you will see that there is some reduction from essay 1 to essay 3. And to explain this reduction, I decided to look at the pragmatic functions of the pronoun. So in other words, why and how they used it. Originally, I decided to use the classification of Latham, who identified the following functions of the author in the text. Writer, so when they guide the reader through the text; arguer, when they present claims; researcher, when they write about the research; and evaluator, when they evaluate information. This classification was successfully applied to the analysis of research articles, but it turned out that these 4 categories couldn't cover all the cases of students' pronoun use in their essays. I identified quite a lot of cases where the students referred to their personal experience, as on the examples on the slide. There were also many cases with reference to knowledge, when they wrote about their own knowledge, something I know or I do not know much about something. So the distribution of these functions is presented on the table, and I'd like to mention several points here. The first one is that there hasn't been identified a single case when the students performed the role of a researcher, probably because they didn't associate writing an essay as a kind of a research activity. The second thing that I'd like to mention is that the number of cases when they referred to personal experience and to knowledge is pretty high. And sometimes their writing looked more like fiction, not academic texts. And though I tried to encourage them not to use expressions like I do not remember, or I do not know much, or I've never thought about it, it didn't seem to have any effect because, for example, if you look at the number of references to personal experience, first this number dropped after the explanation, but then it raised again, making the difference between the first and third essay of only 2.5, something like 2.5%. And the last point, which is the most important from my point of view, is that the number of cases when they perform the function of arguer is very high, especially the first essay. It comprises more than half of all the cases. So, besides, when students acted as arguers, their claims were very strong. So they would use, I absolutely agree with something. I do believe, yes, it really matters. I strongly believe, etc. So
in this case, these are the native or non-native?
No, non-native. I'm talking only about non-native. Sorry, I didn't. I analyzed only essays written by Russian students because I didn't. Well, we used American students' essays only like some examples, some parts to analyze. This is all about Russian students. Yeah, all about Russian students. So yes, they were pretty strong in their claims, and sorry. All these statements might be appropriate, of course. yes? But the only problem was that they made these claims without any reference to sources. Just nothing. The claim, and that's it. And I think that the general reduction in the use of first-person pronouns and might be explained by the fact that as soon as students realized that they should support their claims somehow, that they should provide some evidence, they simply started to make fewer claims. Their claims remained very strong, rather strong, but they started to make fewer claims, and that's why we see some reduction in the number of cases when they acted as arguers. Okay. And so just to test this hypothesis, I decided to look at how they introduced these sources. And again, if you look at the table, you will see that even in essay 1, they used 2.5 references per an essay, and considering that the essays were pretty short, it might seem okay, yes, but again, how they did it, that's a typical example. You see that number 2 in brackets simply refers us, readers, to the reference list. There is no analysis, there is nothing, no interpretation of the references. And again, if we look back at the table, we will see that those cases, those references that are not introduced, the percentage without in first essay is very high. And again, a typical example would be like that. So the student simply puts the quotation without any attempt to analyze or to introduce it. And in those cases where the students did introduce the references, they usually used those verbs and word combinations that have no evaluative meaning, something mention, say, write, give a definition, etc. Well, in general, I might say that from essay 1 to essay 3, first of all, we can see that the total number of references increased a little bit. The number of references that were not introduced decreased, and in general, there was a qualitative shift in the number of different verbs and expressions that the students used to introduce the sources, with some of them in essay 3 having evaluative meaning. And now, just being aware of time, I will say just a few words about the use of hedges and boosters, because that's also how they position themselves and how they make their claims. In general, they do not use hedges a lot. They didn't use a lot of hedges in first essay, and they didn't use a lot of hedges in third essay, again, though I tried to encourage them to do that. And well, there were some examples of even clusters of hedges. These examples were very, very rare. And I constantly tried to tell them that they shouldn't be very strict in their judgments, they shouldn't be very strong in their arguments, but they seem to have, and they seem to have achieved being not very strong, not by increasing the number of hedges, but by decreasing the number of boosters. And that's what is demonstrated in the next table. In general, you see that they use much more boosters in their writing than hedges. And again, I give the examples with absolutely agree to believe, etc. And in general, the number of boosters decreased from first to third essay. So again, this suggests that the students started, I would say, being aware of how they write, but they simply tried to not to be very categorical in their writing. So this small analysis showed that in general, in essay 3, students were a little bit less categorical. There were some slight changes in their style of writing, how they presented arguments, how they positioned themselves. And the fact that the students were constantly engaged in reading and evaluating texts written by their peers abroad, who, again, I would like to stress, were simply more experienced writers. It also influenced somehow the way they wrote their text. So I might suggest that when students find themselves in an international context, with some of them being more experienced in writing than others, they might learn not only from us instructors, but also from each other. And it is interesting interesting that, again, in their course evaluation, both American and Russian students stressed that one of the outcomes of the course was development of critical thinking skills. And quite surprisingly, again, because it was not a language course, and improving academic writing was not a goal of the course, 4 students out of 12 who completed the evaluation again wrote that they learned how to write essays in English. And that's from one student. I don't know why he or she, well, stresses that he or she learned how to make my writing coherent, but still, they mentioned that they improved their writing skills. So that's all I wanted to tell you. So I've got several minutes for questions, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
I have some experience of teaching American students academic writing, and in your talk, which was fantastic, and it was very interesting, you said, well, American students know how to write, which was not really
I know. I mean, why I'm saying that they were not first-year students.
Right.
They were, the majority of them were in their third-year studies. Why I didn't make this distinction between native and non-native speakers, because in the group of American students, of course there were some native speakers, but there were other people, I mean, from China, from Ukraine, and even some, well, Russian student. Well, she was Russian by nationality, but she came something like 10 years ago to America, so well, she might be considered American, but English was not her first language. So, that's why, and still, all their, I mean, the quality of all their essays were much higher than those of Russian students, unfortunately. Sorry.
No, my question was, could you see any similar problems or kind of overlapping issues that both groups of students shared in terms of the kinds of challenges they had with their writing?
Well, you see, it was very, of course, it was, I haven't mentioned it, but it was the second course we taught together. And during the first course, I asked my American colleague to grade all the essays and to give feedback. And she said it was just the worst experience in her own life, because she had to, I mean, she had to give feedback to Russian students who didn't know how to write. Well, and now we did it separately, but I read her comments, and of course she also identified that, okay, your argument is not that strong, so you do not provide enough evidence. Sometimes she pointed out that the language should be something more formal or less colloquial. But again, the difference, if you compare this, well, it is really a huge difference. And my students, they would come to me and say, okay, we do not know how to do it in our native language. And that's why I constantly stress, it's not because they are better, you are worse. It's simply because you have never